Where the sea becomes, land Venice begins, before it has a name in a place that does not feel like solid ground at all. Imagine the northern end of the Adriatic Sea at dawn, when the light is thin and pearly and the horizon seems to dissolve. Here the water does not meet the land in a clean line. Instead it loosens into a wide lagoon, shallow shifting threaded with sandbars and mud flats, broken into small islands that appear and disappear with the tides. Reed beds whisper in the wind. Salt hangs faintly in the air. The water is sometimes silver, sometimes green, sometimes the color of slate, depending on cloud and season. For most of ancient history, places like this were not the obvious heart of a civilization. They were margins useful for fishing for salt, for sheltering small boats, but not for grand cities. Empires preferred firm ground straight roads, reliable harbors, defensible hills. And yet it is precisely because this landscape is uncertain, because it refuses to be easily mastered, that it becomes in time one of Europe's most powerful crossroads. To understand the Venetian Empire, it helps to begin with the long geography of the Mediterranean world, and with the older powers that shaped the shores around this lagoon. For centuries, the Roman Empire held the Italian peninsula together with roads and law, and connected it outward with sea lanes. Along the northern Adriatic Roman towns thrived on commerce and administration places like Aquileia and Altinum, settled on the mainland where the land was stable, and the fields could be counted and taxed. The lagoon, by comparison, was a quiet hinterland. Fishermen worked its shallows. Salt was gathered where seawater could be guided into pans and left to evaporate under the sun. Small communities knew the channels, the winds, the changing moods of the water. They lived with the sense that the sea could provide but also erase. Then, as the Roman world in the west began to fracture, the northern Adriatic became a frontier again, one that felt, for many ordinary people, frighteningly open. In the 5th and 6th centuries, waves of conflict and migration rolled across the Italian mainland. Old protections weakened. New armies arrived. Some came as federates or allies, others as conquerors. Cities that had once seemed permanent learned what it meant to be vulnerable. Aquileia, among others, suffered terrible destruction in the storms of invasion that swept through the region. The details of every movement are complex and the sources are often uneven, but the human pattern is easy to recognize when the mainland becomes dangerous. People look for refuge where power is harder to project. The lagoon offered that. Not because it was comfortable life on small wet islands demanded constant labor, but because it was awkward terrain for heavy armies and unfamiliar horses. The channels could confuse strangers. The mud could swallow the careless. The tides could turn a path into a trap. For people seeking safety, the lagoon was not a paradise. It was a shelter made from uncertainty. At first, the communities that gathered there did not set out to create an empire. They were not dreaming of marble facades or world-spanning trade. They were trying to survive. They built on whatever ground held. They drove wooden piles into mud and sand, learning slowly through experience that timber could become a kind of skeleton for a settlement. They raised simple structures, repaired boats, stored salt-traded fish and small goods with the mainland whenever it was possible. They lived between elements, not fully sea, not fully land, but something else, an in-between world, and around them larger political forces continued to shift. The Eastern Roman Empire, what later generations often call Byzantium, retained influence in parts of Italy for a time. Ravenna, not far from the lagoon, became a center of imperial administration. The Adriatic remained a sea of connection, and Constantinople remained in many minds the glittering anchor of legitimacy. Yet the empire's strength in Italy was contested, and its resources were pulled in many directions. On the mainland, new powers rose. The Lombards, arriving in the late 6th century, carved out a kingdom across large parts of Italy. Later, the Frankish world pressed southward. Borders hardened and softened, alliances changed. And in the midst of these shifting sovereignties, the Lagoon communities learned a crucial habit, the art of living near great powers without being wholly absorbed by them. This is one of the deep roots of Venetian political culture. Venice does not begin as a single city with a single founding moment. It begins as a network of settlements, small island communities, each with its own local identity, learning to cooperate, because cooperation is the only way to endure. In time, these communities begin to form institutions that match their landscape. Their power is not based on broad farmland or a single fortress on a hill. It is based on boats, channels, and knowledge on the ability to move through water that others cannot easily read. It is based on flexible leadership and negotiated authority because rigid systems fracture under the pressure of such an environment. And it is based on trade because in a lagoon you cannot live only on what you grow. You must exchange, barter, connect. Even in these early centuries, the Adriatic is not an empty water. It is a corridor. To the east lie the Balkan coasts and the Greek world. Farther down, the wider Mediterranean stretches toward Egypt, Syria, and North Africa regions that have long supplied grain, oil, wine, and luxury goods. To the north and west lie the Alpine passes and the river networks that lead toward Central Europe. Whoever can connect these zones, whoever can move goods between them efficiently and safely, can grow rich. But to do so requires stability ships and protection. At first, protection comes mostly from the shifting umbrella of Byzantium and from the lagoon's own difficult terrain. But as centuries pass, the lagoon communities begin to develop something even more powerful, a reputation. A reputation for ships that arrive on time, for merchants who keep accounts carefully, for leaders who negotiate with patience, for a place where goods can be stored, exchanged, reloaded, and forwarded, for a people who belong to Italy and yet are slightly apart from it, looking outward toward the sea more than inward toward the fields. There is a quiet transformation here, almost like the slow settling of silt. What begins as refuge becomes habit. What begins as habit becomes identity. And what begins as identity becomes ambition, though the ambition is rarely announced with trumpets. It arrives as a series of practical decisions, each one small enough to seem reasonable in the moment, to build a better dock to settle a dispute, among islands to appoint a leader who can speak for many, to secure trade privileges, to invest in ships to maintain peace within, so that business can flow without interruption. By the 7th century, this lagoon world is no longer merely a scattering of hiding places. It is becoming a community with a voice, one that will soon choose a more formal leadership, not as a royal crown, but as an office meant to serve a complex, watery society. And as the sun rises higher over the Adriatic, turning the ripples to bright glass, you can almost feel the next era forming, an era when Venice will begin to speak in the language of states and treaties, and when the lagoon will learn how to turn its fragile geography into a kind of strength. The first Doge and the shape of a republic. In the lagoon's earliest generations, there is no single moment when Venice begins. There is only the slow discovery that the islands can hold more than shelter. that they can hold a future. At first, each community is a small world. One island knows the best fishing grounds, another keeps the salt pans, another sits closer to the mainland and trades more often in grain timber and tools. Paths between them are not roads but channels, and the channels are never entirely the same from season to season. A winter storm can shift a sandbar. A spring flood can cloud a route with silt. The lagoon teaches a certain kind of attention, careful, quiet, practical. It is the kind of attention that later becomes a Venetian strength. But attention alone does not create unity. Unity arrives because the outside world keeps pressing in. On the mainland, power is changing hands again and again. A village might wake to find a new authority speaking in a new accent, demanding loyalty in a new way. The great old Roman city network is damaged, and the new rulers of Italy, different kingdoms and dukes, do not always agree on borders or obligations. Even when violence is far away, uncertainty travels quickly like a cold wind. For the lagoon communities, the question becomes simple and constant. How can they protect their fragile stability without becoming the pawn of someone else's struggle? For a time, the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantines, offers a kind of distant umbrella. The imperial administration in Ravenna the Exarchate still reaches across parts of the Adriatic world. In practice, this protection is uneven and often strained, but it matters symbolically. It anchors the lagoon settlements to an older tradition of legitimacy law treaties, and the idea that authority can be negotiated, not only seized. At the same time, the lagoon people are learning what they can do that others cannot. They can move quickly on water. They can hide among channels. They can transport goods with surprising efficiency. And because they do not sit on broad farmland, they are forced to trade to build relationships to turn their location into a hinge between worlds. Trade, however, brings its own dangers. Goods attract thieves and raiders. Small vessels loaded with salt or fish or timber can be easy prey. And so the lagoon communities begin to coordinate not just for commerce but for defense. This is where the earliest outlines of Venetian government begin to appear, not in a grand declaration, but in the practical need to decide together. Local leaders, often remembered in later traditions as tribunes or elders, manage disputes, organize labor, and represent their communities in negotiations. But as the lagoon's network grows, local authority is not enough. Someone must speak for many islands at once, especially when dealing with outside powers, Byzantine officials, Lombard dukes, or other neighbors along the coast. And so, by tradition, the office of the Doge is born. The word itself is rooted in the Latin dux, a leader, a commander. Yet in Venice it becomes something distinctive. A Doge is not quite a king, not quite a general, not quite a governor. The office is shaped by the lagoon's social reality. Many communities, many families, many interests, all tied together by water. The traditional date given for the first Doge is 697, and later Venetian chroniclers even preserve the name of an early figure, Paoluccio Anafesto. Modern historians debate the exact details of these earliest years. Sources are thin, and later generations sometimes polished the past into tidy shapes. Yet the broader truth remains steady. Around the turn of the 8th century, a centralized leadership begins to emerge because the lagoon settlements need a single voice to survive and to prosper. In these first phases, the Doge's seat is not fixed in the Venice people later imagine. The lagoon has several important centers, Eraclea, Torcello, Malamocco, each with its own advantages and its own claims to prominence. The story of early Venice is, in part, the story of how power slowly drifts toward the cluster of islands that will become the Rialto, the urban heart we recognize today. This drift is not romantic, it is strategic. The Rialto area sits in a position that feels both central and elusive. It is surrounded by water routes that can be defended, and it is close enough to the mainland to trade yet far enough to avoid becoming easily occupied. It is also placed well for gathering goods coming from different directions down the rivers, from the north across the Adriatic, from the east along the coast from the south. In a world where land routes can be blocked by war or tolls, water becomes the quiet road of reliability. As the Doges and their advisors learn to govern, they also learn that Venice must master two arts at once, the art of diplomacy and the art of shipbuilding. Diplomacy because Venice sits between great powers. If it leans too heavily toward Byzantium, it risks provoking mainland rivals. If it breaks away too openly, it risks losing the privileges and protections that keep its trade flowing. So Venice becomes a place where compromise is not weakness, but method, where agreements are crafted like careful knots, tight enough to hold, flexible enough not to snap. Shipbuilding, because everything depends on the sea, not only the movement of goods, but the movement of messages, the transport of officials, the ability to respond to threats. The lagoon provides timber routes and sheltered water for construction and testing. Over time, Venetian craftsmanship becomes a kind of silent language spoken in hulls, and rigging in the clean joinery of oars, in the ability to build vessels that can handle both open sea and shallow channels. All of this begins to form a political temperament. Venice does not primarily expand by conquering inland fields. It expands by securing routes. It thinks in harbors and islands, in stores and supplies, in agreements and guarantees. Its leaders develop the habit of looking outward, measuring winds, reading the broader world like a chart. Even when the city is still small, the mindset is already maritime, and commerce, even in these early centuries, is more than money. It is social order. Merchants need predictable rules. They need contracts that mean something. They need authorities who can settle disputes without endless blood feuds. So Venice's leadership begins to cultivate stability as a civic virtue. The Doge, whatever his personal ambitions, must appear as the guardian of a shared system because the lagoon's prosperity depends on trust. Yet, trust is never automatic. It must be repeated, performed, reinforced. That is why ritual begins to matter. The Doge's presence, the gatherings of leaders, the formal language of decisions, these are not decorations. They are the soft architecture of unity. They tell the scattered islands we belong to something larger than ourselves. By the early 9th century, Venice is increasingly ready for a stronger identity, one that can bind politics and faith, commerce, and myth, the daily labor of boatmen, and the long ambitions of merchants. The lagoon has learned how to speak with one voice. Now it will learn how to present itself to the world as a chosen city watched over by a powerful symbol. And it is in that quiet space between practicality and destiny that the next chapter begins, when a relic arrives from far away, and Venice's story gains a saint whose wings will stretch over its banners for centuries. Saint Mark comes home. There are moments in the life of a city when something arrives that is more than an object. It may be carried in a ship's hold, wrapped in cloth, guarded by a few anxious men who keep their voices low. It may come at night when the lagoon is dark and the water makes only a soft, patient sound against wood. And yet, once it is brought ashore, once it is spoken of and believed in, It becomes a kind of new gravity, pulling identity, ambition, and memory into a single center. In the year 829, Venice receives such an arrival. The story, as Venetians would tell it for centuries, begins far away in Alexandria, the great port of Egypt, an old city of libraries and sailors of stone quays and hot wind. There, according to tradition, the body of St. Mark the Evangelist had long been kept. Mark, the writer of one of the Gospels, had become the patron saint of Alexandria, and his presence there was a sign of dignity and sacred continuity. But Venice is growing restless in its early maturity. It has leaders now. It has ships and trade and a taste for negotiation. And it also has a problem that every young state faces, sooner or later, the problem of legitimacy. To be stable, a political community needs more than defenses and markets. It needs a story strong enough to unify its people and persuade outsiders that it belongs among the older powers of the world. Venice is neither a Roman imperial capital nor an ancient inland kingdom. It is a city of water and commerce, new enough to feel vulnerable to the accusations of rivals. In such a world, a saint is not merely a religious figure. A saint can become a flag, a seal, a shared heartbeat. Venice already has churches and local devotions, but it does not yet have a patron of unmistakable stature, someone whose name can carry authority across sea lanes and courts. Saint Theodore is honored, and many other holy figures are revered, but Venice is searching for a symbol that can match the scale of its rising ambitions. So the tradition says that two Venetian merchants, often named as Buono da Malamocco and Rustico da Torcello, make a daring decision. They will bring Mark to Venice. Later chronicles describe the theft with a kind of proud reverence, as if audacity itself were a virtue when it serves the Republic. The relic is said to have been concealed under layers of pork or other unclean meats meant to discourage inspection by Muslim guards who controlled the city. Whether every detail is exactly as later Venetians like to tell it, the broader event seems real enough. Sometime around 829, Venice gains the relics of St. Mark, and this fact becomes one of the most powerful foundations of its self-image. If you listen closely beneath the legend, you can hear the reality of a maritime world. Goods moved in secrecy, identities shifting across borders, careful timing, bribes or permissions, a ship departing with precious cargo, and the constant fear of interception. The Adriatic, which might look calm on a sunny day, is a place where a single storm can wreck a vessel, where pirates can appear like sudden shadows, where a wrong decision can scatter a crew and erase a plan. But the ship makes it home, and when it reaches the lagoon, when the relic is received, Venice does what it does best. It turns a practical act into a public ritual, and a ritual into a lasting institution. A church is raised at first, a smaller and earlier version of what will later become the splendid Basilica of San Marco. The location matters. The saint is not placed at the edge of the community. He is placed close to the seat of political power, near the Doge's residence. This is not a subtle choice. It ties sacred authority to civic authority. It suggests that the city's government is not merely convenient, but blessed. From this moment on, Venice begins to speak in a new language about itself. It is no longer only a refuge of islanders or a clever trading hub between empires. It becomes a city under the protection of an evangelist, one of the writers who gave the Christian world its most foundational texts. And that changes how Venice can present itself to others. Think of the effect on diplomacy. A letter sealed with Mark's name carries a different weight. A Venetian ambassador can speak not only as a representative of merchants, but as the servant of a city chosen by a saint. Rulers and bishops who understand the symbolic economy of relics read this as a sign Venice is not a temporary settlement. It is a place that intends to endure. It also changes how Venetians see themselves. Identity in the medieval world is woven from faith ritual and communal memory. The saint becomes a shared point of focus for people who come from different islands and different families. The Lagoon communities, once loosely linked by necessity, now have a sacred figure around whom to gather. Soon the symbol of Mark begins to spread beyond church walls. The winged lion Mark's emblem will become one of the most recognizable images in Europe. It will stand in stone and gold in paint and mosaic carved into columns and stamped onto coins. The lion is both fierce and serene, holding a book that speaks of peace and authority at once. It suggests a city that can be gentle in its rituals, but firm in its protection of trade and law. In a way, the lion also suits Venice's character. It is a creature associated with power, but it is not a symbol of a single king. It becomes the emblem of a republic, an impersonal, enduring identity that belongs to the state itself, not merely to any one ruler. Of course, symbols invite rivalry. Venice's neighbors are watching. The mainland powers, older towns with older bishops, understand what a relic means. There are competing claims, especially from places like Aquileia, which has its own ancient Christian history and its own ambitions. If Venice can claim Mark, it can claim a special place in the hierarchy of sacred prestige. That is not only spiritual, it is political, and it can shift the balance of influence. So Venice must guard its relic not only from thieves, but from narratives. It must defend the story that Mark belongs to Venice now. It must repeat the tale in festivals, in chronicles, in art, until it feels as natural as the tides. And Venice does something else quietly but profoundly. It begins to shape its cityscape around performance. The area that will become the Piazza San Marco is not merely a convenient open space. It becomes a stage on which Venice will display itself. Here, religious processions and political ceremonies can merge. Here, the Doge can appear in a context that suggests his authority is part of a larger order. The basilica, with its Byzantine-influenced splendor and shimmering mosaics, will eventually speak visually of Venice's position between East and West Italian in its roots, yet deeply connected to the empire and styles of the Eastern Mediterranean. This is one of the subtle secrets of Venice's rise. It does not simply trade with the world. It absorbs the world's languages, styles, and habits, and then turns them into Venetian forms. A ship returns from the East with spices and silks, yes, but it also returns with ideas about architecture, about ceremony, about icons, and holy spaces. Venice learns to weave those influences into something that feels unique. It is neither fully Byzantine nor fully Latin, neither fully Eastern nor fully Western. It is itself a city made from meeting points, and from here, Venice's political evolution becomes more intense. Because once a city claims a saint, it must build institutions worthy of that claim. It must cultivate stability. It must control its internal conflicts. It must present a calm face to traitors and allies. The saint becomes a standard against which civic behavior is measured. The Republic begins slowly to discipline itself, developing habits of law and counsel that will grow more complex with time. Yet the lagoon remains the lagoon. The same water that brings a relic home can also bring fire, famine, or danger. Venice is still vulnerable to sudden catastrophe. Its buildings are still largely wood. Its wealth, growing as it is, still depends on fragile shipping routes and delicate political balances. And soon, in the year 976, a great fire will tear through the heart of the city, testing whether Venice's new identity and institutions are strong enough to survive disaster, and strong enough to rebuild not only what is lost, but what is dreamed. The Lion of Mark has taken its place above the water. Now the city must learn what it means to endure. Firestone and the heart of the city. In Venice, everything feels close together. A street can be no wider than two outstretched arms. A courtyard can hide behind a wall and then suddenly open like a small breath of space. A canal can narrow into a quiet ribbon where the water reflects only brick and sky. In such a city, sound travels softly, but far the creak of a mooring rope, the tap of a foot on stone, the low murmur of voices crossing a bridge. And in such a city built in its early centuries, largely of wood, fire is not only a danger. Fire is a fear that lives in the background of daily life, like a dry wind. One evening in the year 976, that fear becomes real. The sources that tell us about the Great Fire of Venice are shaped by the concerns of later generations, and they do not always agree on every detail. But they speak with one clear voice about the scale of the destruction. A blaze sweeps through the political heart of the city. Buildings that represent the authority of the Doge and the stability of the state are damaged. The center of Venice, where government and ceremony have begun to gather around the cult of St. Mark, becomes smoke and ruin. To understand why this matters so deeply, it helps to pause and imagine what Venice is at this moment. It is not yet the marble and gold dream that later travelers will gasp at. It is a growing maritime community, wealthier than many of its neighbors, more connected than most, and increasingly confident in its ability to bargain with great powers. But it remains fragile. Its foundations are literally driven into mud and sand. Its food supply depends on shipments and markets. Its security depends on ships' alliances and the discipline of its citizens. And its identity, newly strengthened by St. Mark, still needs to prove that it can endure. Fire tests more than timber. It tests institutions. In many medieval cities, catastrophe exposes hidden rivalries. When the roofs collapse, old grievances rise and people scramble not only to rebuild, but to blame. In Venice, too, there are tensions among families competing for influence among different quarters of the Lagoon, among those who favor strong leadership and those who fear it. And in the years around this fire, Venice is already wrestling with one of its most enduring political problems: how to create a stable government without turning the Doge into a king. The Doge is powerful, and the office is becoming more prestigious. Yet Venice is a society of merchants and ship owners, of families who value their independence and guard their privileges with careful pride. They need leadership, but they mistrust the kind of personal rule that can seize property, change laws abruptly, or drag the city into private wars. So the catastrophe of 976 lands in a city that is still shaping its political balance. When fire tears through the central buildings, damaging the Doge's residence, threatening sacred spaces, scorching the structures where decisions are made, it creates a kind of silence. For a moment, the illusion of permanence vanishes. Everything that seemed established, offices, rituals, the very idea of continuity, looks like a fragile arrangement perched above water. And then, as the smoke thins, Venice does what it will do again and again across the centuries. It rebuilds. But the rebuilding is not simply a repair of what was, it is a statement about what Venice intends to become. In the aftermath, there is a gradual shift from wood to more durable materials and from improvisation to design. Stone becomes more important not only as a practical defense against future fires, but as a symbol. Stone says we expect to remain. Stone says our government is not temporary. Stone says the lagoon is no longer only refuge, it is homeland. This is how architecture and politics begin to fuse in Venice. The civic center around St. Mark is not just a collection of buildings. It becomes a carefully cultivated image of the Republic. The Doge's palace, in its evolving form, will come to express a paradox that sits at the heart of Venetian rule authority and restraint, splendor, and procedure, personal leadership wrapped tightly in public institutions. Even at this early stage, the rebuilding strengthens the sense that Venice's power is meant to be seen. A republic does not have a royal crown to dazzle foreign envoys. It must impress in other ways, through ceremony, through order, through the beauty of its public spaces, through the discipline of its officials. The renewed heart of the city becomes a stage where Venice can display what merchants and sailors alone cannot prove its legitimacy as a state. And behind the visible rebuilding, something quieter is happening in the machinery of government. Venice's leaders begin to refine the systems that limit the Doge's ability to act alone. This does not happen in a single reform with a clear date carved into stone. It happens through accumulated practice, through councils that gain weight, through rules that harden into habit. Over time, the Doge becomes less an unchecked ruler and more a symbol, an essential figure, but surrounded by advisors, watched by institutions, constrained by expectation. It is a slow invention, the invention of a republic that can survive not only fire, but ambition, because ambition is always present. In a society growing rich on trade, wealth concentrates, families rise. Some begin to dream of turning their influence into hereditary power. Others fear that dream. The lagoon, which once protected refugees from outsiders, now must protect the city from itself, from the possibility that it will fracture into faction and personal rule. In this sense, the fire of 976 is not only a physical disaster. It is a moment that forces Venice to confront what kind of city it wants to be. When a palace burns, the question is not only how to rebuild it, but what it should represent when it stands again. Venice's answer, expressed in stone ritual and governance, is that the state must be larger than any single man. The Doge may preside, but the city must belong to a broader civic body. Decisions must feel anchored in procedure. Justice must feel predictable. Trade must feel safe. A foreign merchant must be able to enter the lagoon and believe that contracts will be honored, disputes will be settled, and the rules of the marketplace will not shift like sandbars with every change of mood. And in the decades that follow, Venice's political culture becomes steadily more distinctive. It grows more formal, more careful, more obsessed with continuity. It records decisions. It develops offices. It cultivates an image of calm dignity, what later generations will call La Serenissima, the most serene republic. Serenity in Venice is not only a mood, it is a policy. It is the outward face of a city that understands how quickly chaos can spread in narrow streets and wooden beams. Meanwhile, the sea continues to whisper its own demands. Trade is expanding. The Adriatic coast is full of opportunities and dangers, pirates and rival towns, small islands that can serve as havens, or traps coastal cities that might welcome Venetian commerce today and resent it tomorrow. The wealth of the East, spices, silks, precious goods, still flows through older networks that Venice hopes to enter more deeply. And every voyage requires protection coordination and the ability to respond quickly to threats. So as the city rebuilds its center, it also begins to look outward more urgently. Venice's leaders understand something that is almost geological in its simplicity. The lagoon can shelter a city, but it cannot feed an empire unless the sea lanes remain open. Venice's future depends on controlling movement of ships of goods, of information, across the waters that connect Italy to the wider Mediterranean. And the form of Venice's government, its councils, its habits of negotiation, its public rituals, begins to serve that outward purpose. A stable republic can build fleets. A stable republic can sign treaties and keep them. A stable republic can send envoys across the sea with confidence that their words carry the weight of a united state. By the time the scars of the fire have faded into memory, Venice has gained something more valuable than any single building. It has gained the conviction that it can lose and rebuild, that it can turn catastrophe into a kind of strengthening like wood hardened by salt air. It has learned that its heart is not only in its palaces and basilicas, but in the shared discipline that holds its people together. And now, with its civic center rising again, more durable, more deliberate, the city turns its gaze to the Adriatic itself, as if seeing in those waters not merely a border, but a road. The next era begins with sails on the horizon and the slow, determined work of making the sea feel, in some quiet way, Venetian. The Adriatic becomes a Venetian sea. In Venice, the sea is never just scenery. It is a livelihood, a threat, a highway, and a mirror. It reflects the city's facades, yes, but it also reflects its choices. When Venice grows richer, the water carries heavier cargo. When Venice grows anxious, the water carries more warships. When Venice grows ambitious, the water becomes not a boundary, but a field of quiet opportunity. By the late 9th and 10th centuries, the lagoon city has rebuilt its center and strengthened its habits of government. Now it turns its attention outward with a steadier gaze. The Adriatic is close enough to feel like a neighborhood sea, yet wide enough to be dangerous. Its coasts are lined with small ports, islands, and rival communities. Its winds can be gentle in the morning and harsh by afternoon. And along its routes move the lifeblood of Venetian prosperity, salt timber, grain, iron cloth, and increasingly the rarer goods that link Europe to the eastern Mediterranean. If you listen for the mood of this era, it is not a sudden trumpet call to conquest. It is more like a door opening. Venice begins to realize that survival in the lagoon is not sufficient. A city can hide, but it cannot hide forever and still thrive. Commerce depends on reliability. Reliability depends on safety. Safety in a maritime world depends on control, at least enough control to keep the routes open to deter raiders and to punish those who prey on shipping. The Adriatic in these centuries is not a peaceful lake. Pirates and coastal raiders threaten merchant vessels. Local rulers along the coast may demand tolls or seize cargo. In some places, rival towns compete for the same trade. In others, political instability on land spills into the sea, turning ports into traps. For a merchant republic, these dangers are not abstract. They are felt in delayed shipments, in missing ships, in widows, waiting on quays, in markets, suddenly short of goods. So Venice begins to act not always by direct conquest at first, but by a pattern it will repeat again and again a mix of forced diplomacy and practical administration. It sends fleets to patrol, it organizes convoys, it negotiates with coastal communities, offering protection in exchange for privileges. Sometimes it intervenes militarily against piracy, not as a moral crusade, but as a business necessity. The sea must become predictable enough that Venetian merchants can plan voyages like steady routines rather than gambles with fate. This is the beginning of what later generations will call the Venetian Maritime Empire, an empire not primarily of inland provinces, but of sea lanes, islands, and ports. It is a kind of empire that fits Venice's character, stitched together by contracts and oaths by harbors and warehouses by governors and garrisons, placed like careful weights along the routes. One of the first major arenas for this outward movement is the eastern Adriatic coast Dalmatia and its islands along broken shoreline facing Venice across the water. This coast is dotted with cities and communities with their own histories and loyalties, sometimes tied to Byzantine influence, sometimes pulled by local rulers, sometimes leaning toward the Latin West. The sea between Venice and Dalmatia is not simply a gap, it is a corridor, and whoever can keep that corridor safe gains immense advantage. Venice's leaders understand this with a sailor's clarity. If Venetian ships must travel south toward the wider Mediterranean, they need stopping points, places to shelter from storms, to take on water, and supplies to repair damage, to wait out dangerous conditions. They also need intelligence news of pirate movements, of shifting alliances, of hostile fleets. Coastal footholds provide that. A friendly harbor is not just a convenience, it is a form of security. So Venice begins to cultivate influence along the Adriatic's eastern shore. Sometimes it is welcomed, especially if local communities suffer from raids and see Venetian protection as a relief. Sometimes it is resisted, especially if Venetian involvement feels like domination. And Venice, always alert to the dangers of overreach, often prefers arrangements that look like mutual benefit protection and trade privileges exchanged for loyalty and access. Over time, these relationships begin to take on more formal shape. Venice is not merely visiting these coasts, it is weaving them into a system, and with every such thread, Venice's navy becomes more central to its identity, not only as a tool of war, but as a tool of statecraft. The ships become floating expressions of the Republic's will. A fleet arriving in a harbor can be a promise of protection, of commerce, of connection. It can also be a warning. Venice learns to speak through sails, yet it does not speak loudly. Its power, even when firm, is often wrapped in ceremony and law. This is one of the quiet peculiarities of Venetian expansion. It often comes dressed as administration. Where a land empire might stamp a conquered province with new borders and new taxes, Venice tends to install officials, set standards, enforce contracts, regulate trade, and build infrastructure. It prefers stability over spectacle. A port that functions smoothly is worth more than a ruined enemy city. A coastline that pays and cooperates is worth more than a coastline that smolders and resents. Of course, none of this is gentle for everyone. Venetian influence can be heavy. Local autonomy can shrink. Taxes and obligations can follow. And yet Venice's method is rarely the chaotic violence of a raiding power. It is a colder, more enduring approach to make itself necessary. A merchant who wants to ship safely begins to rely on Venetian patrols. A coastal town threatened by raiders begins to rely on Venetian protection. A ruler who wants access to goods begins to rely on Venetian markets. Dependency grows quietly, like the slow accumulation of salt on a rope. and as dependency grows, Venice's internal institutions adjust to manage it. Governing distant ports requires officials who can be trusted, supervised, and replaced. It requires record-keeping. It requires a system for handling disputes between Venetians and locals, between merchants and ship owners, between governors and councils. It requires the ability to mobilize fleets quickly and sustain them with supplies and wages. The outward movement of Venice is inseparable from the inward strengthening of its bureaucracy and law. In this era, you can begin to sense how Venice becomes Venice, not merely a city, but a machine of order built for the sea. The lagoon's geography continues to shape everything. The Venetians are at home in shallow water, in narrow channels, in coastal navigation. Their ships are designed with these conditions in mind. Their sailors learn the Adriatic's moods, the sudden bora wind that can slash down from the northeast, the shifting currents, the sheltered lee of an island, the peril of a rocky approach at night. This intimate knowledge becomes a strategic advantage. It is difficult for an outsider to compete with a people whose entire world is maritime. Meanwhile, Venice's trade expands in scope and sophistication. Salt remains foundational salt that preserves food and underwrites basic commerce. Timber and iron feed shipbuilding. Grain and wine circulate through markets. But increasingly, Venice positions itself as a mediator between different economic zones. Goods from the east begin to appear more often: spices and fine textiles, dyes, and luxury items that can transform a merchant's fortune. Venice's role is to move these goods efficiently to make itself the hinge upon which other economies turn. And in doing so, Venice begins to cultivate a certain reputation, a reputation for calm continuity. Other cities may be richer one decade and ruined the next. Other rulers may be generous today and predatory tomorrow. Venice tries to be predictable. Predictability becomes a kind of power. A merchant prefers a port where rules are known. A foreign envoy respects a state that keeps its agreements. A coastal community, even if wary, may choose Venetian overlordship over the chaos of constant raids. The Adriatic thus becomes something more than water between coasts. It becomes a Venetian environment, a sphere in which Venetian ships are increasingly common, Venetian flags, increasingly recognized, Venetian expectations increasingly enforced. But Venice's leaders also understand an uncomfortable truth: control is never permanent. The sea is too wide, the world too changeable. Every foothold must be maintained. Every alliance must be renewed. Every patrol must be paid. The empire of sea lanes is always at risk of slipping away if the city grows complacent. And beyond the Adriatic lies an even larger stage. To the east, the Byzantine Empire still looms as both protector and partner. To the south and east, the wider Mediterranean brings Venice into contact with Islamic powers and with the ancient trade networks of the Levant and Egypt. These connections promise immense wealth, but they also draw Venice into the politics of great empires. To thrive, Venice will need more than ships and courage. It will need privileges, legal permissions, exemptions, access to markets granted by powerful rulers who can open doors or close them. So, as Venice makes the Adriatic feel increasingly like a home sea, it also begins to look toward Constantinople with new intensity, not as a distant symbol, but as the source of the next great step: formal trading privileges that can transform Venetian commerce from regional strength into Mediterranean force. The sails that cross the Adriatic now seem to point inevitably toward the shimmering eastern horizon, toward the imperial capital, where treaties are written, where markets overflow, and where Venice will learn how valuable a single signature can be. Privileges from Constantinople. When Venice looks east, it does not see only distance. It sees a kind of gravity, an imperial pull that shapes the whole eastern Mediterranean. Beyond the Adriatic, beyond the Ionian waters, and the string of islands that break the sea into stepping stones, there is Constantinople, a city built like a promise, seated between two continents, walled in stone and ceremony, bright with domes and harbors, heavy with the slow authority of an empire that still calls itself Roman. For Venice, Constantinople is not merely a destination, it is an opportunity that can lift a merchant city into something larger than itself. Yet it is also a lesson in dependency, because in the medieval world, trade is never only about ships and cargo, it is about permission. A port can be rich and still be shut out. A merchant can be skilled and still be taxed into failure. A city can sit at a crossroads and still be treated as a minor player unless some greater power recognizes its usefulness. Venice is learning to make itself useful. The Byzantine Empire, especially in the centuries after the West's political fragmentation, remains a sophisticated state with deep experience in diplomacy and commerce. Its officials understand how to bind partners to the empire with documents, privileges, and carefully measured concessions. In return for naval help or for reliable shipping services, Byzantium can grant access that transforms a trading community's future. And Venice, with its ships and its lagoon-born knowledge of maritime life, offers exactly what the empire often needs: transport logistics and a naval presence in the northern Adriatic that can help protect imperial interests. So over time, a relationship takes shape that is neither simple loyalty nor simple independence. It is a partnership unequal at first, but increasingly important on both sides. One of the most valuable currencies in this relationship is privilege, formal rights to trade, to dock, to maintain warehouses, to be judged under certain rules, to pay reduced customs, or sometimes to pay none at all. The precise dates and documents are the kind of things historians love to debate in detail, but the broad pattern is clear. By the late 10th and 11th centuries, Venice is receiving significant advantages from Constantinople, and those advantages feed directly into its rise. You can imagine what it means in practical terms. A Venetian ship arrives at the Golden Horn, the great sheltered inlet beside Constantinople, where masts rise like a forest, and the water is crowded with boats. The city's walls loom above the docks. Officials watch scribes record guards patrol. In most cases, a foreign merchant would face tolls and inspections, the slow grind of fees that accumulate like barnacles. But the Venetian merchant, under the umbrella of imperial favor, finds doors opening more easily. He finds that certain taxes are reduced. He finds that his goods can move faster through the crowded market. He finds that he can rent or own space store cargo conduct business with a stability that others envy. In some periods, Venice is granted its own quarter, an area where Venetians live, worship, and trade within the imperial capital. There are churches with familiar rites, warehouses with the smell of timber, and spiced narrow lanes where Venetian dialect mingles with Greek. It is not a colony in the modern sense, but it is a foothold, something halfway between foreign and local, and deeply valuable in a city that is the greatest market of its age. Privilege is not only profit, privilege is predictability. For a merchant republic, predictability is everything. It allows planning. It encourages investment. It turns risky voyages into scheduled routines and routines into wealth. Venice can build ships more confidently if it knows the ships will have lucrative destinations. It can organize convoys, groups of vessels, sailing together for safety if it knows the routes will repay the cost. It can develop financial habits, contracts, partnerships, and insurance-like arrangements because the world is stable enough to make those tools meaningful. And gradually Venice becomes what Byzantium both wants and fears indispensable. Byzantium wants Venetian ships because they are effective. Venice can carry goods quickly between Italy and the East. It can provide naval support in moments of crisis. It can act as a bridge to the Latin West. But Byzantium also begins to fear Venetian advantage because every privilege granted strengthens the Republic's independence. Venice grows rich not only from carrying goods but from inserting itself into the empire's own commercial bloodstream. This is the delicate balance of the relationship. Byzantium opens its doors, and Venice learns how to walk through them with steady, quiet confidence. Trade itself in this era is like a slow, continuous tide. From the east come luxury goods that feel almost magical to Western buyers, spices that carry the heat of distant climates, silks that shimmer under candlelight, perfumes, dyes fine metalwork, and objects that speak of older, grander courts. From the west come timber for shipbuilding, iron and other materials, wool and cloth, and the everyday goods that keep markets supplied. And always in Venice's own regional economy, there is salt, humble, essential, and valuable in a world that preserves food with crystalline grains. Venice also, with the practical pragmatism of a maritime city, finds itself trading across cultural and religious boundaries. The Mediterranean is not a single unified world. It is an archipelago of faiths, polities, and languages. Yet ships cross these divisions more easily than armies do. Even when religious authorities proclaim bans or restrictions, commerce often finds its own quiet paths, guided by profit and necessity. Venice becomes especially skilled at navigating these complexities, maintaining ties with Christian powers, while also doing business at times with Muslim markets in the broader Mediterranean. It is not always celebrated, and it is not always safe, but it becomes part of Venice's identity, the ability to keep trade moving across fault lines. And while goods move outward, ideas move with them. Venice absorbs influences from Byzantium administrative practices, artistic styles, ceremonial forms, architectural sensibilities. The Basilica of St. Mark, shimmering with mosaics and Eastern grandeur, is part of this story. Venice is learning how to look like a power, not by copying another city entirely, but by blending elements into something distinct. Its identity becomes layered like painted plaster on old brick Latin and Greek Italian and maritime Western and Eastern. Meanwhile, the privileges from Constantinople help Venice build its own internal machine. As trade grows, the Republic becomes more structured, offices multiply, records become more careful, dispute resolution becomes more formal. The state's role in protecting commerce deepens. A Venetian merchant does not sail only with private ambition, he sails under the shadow of the Republic's interest. The lines between public and private blur. The success of an individual voyage becomes part of the city's broader strength, feeding shipyards, financing fleets, funding buildings, supporting diplomacy. And the Doge increasingly stands at the center of a system that is larger than himself. He is the face that greets foreign envoys. He is the figure who embodies continuity. But around him, councils and institutions tighten their grip, making the Republic's stability less dependent on any single personality. This, too, is connected to Byzantium. In Constantinople, Venetians see what an ancient bureaucracy looks like, a state that has endured by recording, regulating, and ritualizing power. Venice, in its own way, learns from this example, adapting it to a smaller, more commercial society. Yet the privileges that enrich Venice also plant seeds of tension. The more Venetian merchants benefit in the imperial capital, the more other trading communities resent them. Rival Italian cities watch with jealousy. Within Byzantium, officials and local merchants can see Venetian advantages as an insult, a sign that foreigners are growing too strong within the empire's own harbor. These resentments do not explode all at once, but they gather quietly like pressure beneath ice. And far beyond, new storms are forming. The Mediterranean of the 11th and 12th centuries is changing. Western Europe is stirring with new energies, religious fervor expansion, and the crusading movement that will soon send fleets and armies eastward. The Byzantine Empire faces threats on multiple fronts. The Islamic world, too, is diverse and dynamic with its own powers rising and falling. In this shifting environment, Venice's privileges become even more valuable and even more dangerous. Because when a world grows tense, the roots that carry trade can also carry war. Venice is nearing the threshold of a new era, one in which it will become not only a beneficiary of empires, but a shaper of them. Before that turning point arrives, though, it helps to pause and step into the everyday rhythm of the Venetian Republic at this stage, the markets, the shipyards, the guilds, the families, and the quiet discipline of a city that lives by the timing of sales. The story for a moment leaves imperial halls and returns to the sound of oars in the lagoon, where ordinary work repeated day after day is building the foundation of an empire. A city of merchants and oars. If you want to understand how Venice becomes an empire, it helps to step away from treaties and great names for a moment and simply listen to the city at work. In the early morning before the sun has fully warmed the roofs, the lagoon is already awake. Water taps softly against wood. A boat glides under a bridge with the quiet assurance of someone who knows every turn. On a narrow quay, men lift baskets and crates, fish still shining with salt, and scale bundles of cloth wrapped tight small barrels that smell faintly of oil or wine. Somewhere close by, a bell rings not sharply, but with a steady patience. Venice is not a city that begins with a sudden rush. It begins like a tide, slowly filling the channels. This is the Venice of the 11th and 12th centuries, not yet the dazzling museum of later centuries, but already a place where the rhythm of commerce shapes everything. The streets are tight, the buildings close, and the air is often damp. Yet in this compact space, the Republic is building something immense. Because Venice's empire does not rise first from armies marching inland, it rises from routines cargo measured and recorded contracts spoken and sealed ships repaired, sails stitched, ropes twisted, accounts balanced. It rises from trust that goods will arrive, that debts will be repaid, that disputes will be settled by law rather than by feud. In most medieval societies, trade is important. In Venice, it is the spine. This is partly because the lagoon demands it. A city on islands cannot simply live off surrounding fields. Grain must be imported. Timber must be brought in for building and ship repair. Even fresh water at times must be carefully collected and managed. The city survives by its ability to draw resources from elsewhere and distribute them through organized exchange. But trade does more than feed the people. It reshapes the society that depends on it. A merchant city learns to value literacy, calculation, record-keeping. It learns to value steady procedure over impulsive violence. It learns that reputation is an economic asset. A merchant known for cheating will find doors closing. A port known for arbitrary rules will lose traffic to competitors. Venice therefore begins to treat law not only as justice but as infrastructure, as essential to commerce, as a dock or a ship. And because trade reaches beyond the lagoon, Venice becomes a city with a wide horizon. You can feel this horizon in the markets. Goods arrive from the mainland: grain, wine, livestock products, timber. But other goods arrive from faraway: spices and silks moving through eastern routes, precious metals, dyes, unusual fabrics. These items are not merely luxuries. They are signals that Venice is connected to a broader world. A spice carried from the east to a Venetian stall is proof that Venetian ships and contracts can bridge vast distances. The city's commercial life is organized through guilds and networks of families. Not all Venetians are merchants, but merchant families increasingly shape the Republic's direction because they hold wealth and connections. Their homes are not only private spaces, they are nodes in a web of partnerships. A marriage might seal a business alliance. A godparent relationship might secure trust. A shared investment in a voyage binds men together in mutual risk. The risk is real. Ships can be lost. Storms can ruin cargo. Pirates can strike. Political changes can close markets overnight. Yet Venice becomes skilled at managing risk through collective organization. Voyages are often financed by partnerships rather than by single individuals spreading danger across several investors. Convoys sail together for protection. The Republic itself may intervene to regulate routes and provide naval escorts. And then there are the ships. A Venetian empire is unimaginable without the physical reality of its fleet. Ships are built, repaired, and improved constantly. The lagoon offers sheltered water for working on hulls and testing vessels. Timber arrives from the mainland and from regions farther north. Iron is imported and worked into nails and fittings. Sailcloth is woven. Rope is twisted in long, careful lengths. The smell of pitch and resin hangs in certain corners of the city, a dark, sharp scent that clings to hands and clothing. Over time, Venetian shipbuilding becomes not just a craft, but a system, an early form of industrial organization. The state's involvement deepens as the stakes rise. The Republic understands that its security and its commerce depend on a reliable fleet. A ship is an investment, yes, but it is also a piece of state power. In this period, the Arsenal Venice's famous shipyard complex begins to develop toward the form that will later astonish visitors. Even in its earlier stages, it represents something remarkable, a civic commitment to maritime capacity. It is a place where labor is organized, where specialized crafts are concentrated, where the city can build and maintain warships and merchant vessels on a scale beyond most rivals. And as the arsenal grows, so does the sense that Venice is a machine designed for the sea. The Republic's political structures reflect this. The Doge presides, symbolizing continuity, but the city is increasingly governed by councils drawn from leading families. These councils are not simply advisory gatherings. They become instruments that regulate commerce, oversee diplomacy, and constrain personal ambition. Venice's leaders understand that stability is the foundation of trade. If the government becomes a tool for one family's dominance, the city will fracture and commerce will suffer. So Venice cultivates checks and balances not from modern ideology but from practical necessity. The result is a political culture that feels unusually disciplined for its era. Venice is not free of conflict. There are rivalries, conspiracies, sharp competition for office and influence. But the Republic tends to absorb these tensions into procedure. Offices rotate, decisions are recorded. Ritual reinforces the idea that the state is greater than any individual. Even the Doge, splendid as he may appear, is gradually bound by law and expectation. This disciplined governance is part of Venice's charm to outsiders. A foreign merchant arriving in the lagoon wants predictability. Venice offers it. The city's courts and officials, imperfect, as all human systems are, aim to provide reliable outcomes. Disputes over cargo debt or partnership can be resolved without constant recourse to violence. In a world where many ports are ruled by the shifting whims of lords, this reliability is a competitive advantage. Venice also develops a distinctive cultural atmosphere, quietly cosmopolitan. Languages mingle in the streets. Greek merchants pass Latin clerics. Slavic sailors bring news from the eastern Adriatic. Traders from Islamic regions directly or indirectly move through Venetian networks. The city absorbs foreign styles in clothing, in decorative motifs, in the goods displayed in shop windows. Venice becomes a place where the wider Mediterranean is present in daily life, not as an abstract idea, but as a living mixture. Religious life is woven into this mixture as well. The Basilica of St. Mark shines with Eastern influence. Processions and festivals offer collective identity. Yet Venice's faith is often practical in its expression, civic religion, tied to the state, expressed through public ritual as much as private devotion. The saint's winged lion looks out from banners and buildings, reminding citizens and visitors alike that this is a republic with a sacred patron and a shared destiny. Still beneath the beauty and order, Venice remains a city built on precarious foundations. The lagoon can flood, storms can damage ships and buildings, disease can arrive on vessels, food supplies can be disrupted. Venice's greatness is always shadowed by the possibility of sudden loss. This creates a particular mood, a slight melancholy beneath the pride. To live in Venice is to understand impermanence and to respond by building institutions that outlast individual lives. In these centuries, the Republic is gathering its strength like a ship tightening its rigging before open sea. Its Adriatic influence is growing. Its Byzantine privileges are enriching it. Its internal governance is becoming more complex and resilient. Its shipyards are becoming more capable. Its merchants are learning to think in terms of networks and long distances. And beyond the horizon, a new force is rising in the Latin West, an expansive religious and military movement that will soon surge toward the eastern Mediterranean. It will call itself Crusade. It will bring fleets and armies, faith and violence, opportunity and catastrophe. And Venice, with its ships and its cool sense of calculation, will find itself at the center of this movement, not merely as a participant, but as a power capable of steering events. The city's oars dip steadily into the water. The markets hum, the councils meet, the arsenal works, and somewhere in the quiet corridors near St. Mark's plans begin to form plans that will carry Venice far beyond the Adriatic into the heart of an empire. The Fourth Crusade and the Shattered Gate. There are turning points that arrive like thunder, loud and unmistakable, and then there are turning points that arrive more quietly through contracts, debts, and practical bargains until almost without warning, the world has tilted. Venice's greatest leap into imperial power belongs to the second kind. It begins not with a battlefield trumpet, but with a negotiation over ships. At the start of the 13th century, the idea of crusade has already been part of Europe's imagination for generations. It is spoken of in churches and courts carried by preachers and princes, wrapped in the language of piety and promise. The declared aim is the recovery of holy places in the eastern Mediterranean, especially Jerusalem. But crusades are also political and economic movements, drawing men across long distances and requiring enormous resources, ship supplies, money organization. And in the Latin West, no one understands maritime logistics better than Venice. By this time, Venice is a republic shaped by commerce and procedure. It has fleet shipyards, experienced sailors, and officials who think in schedules and ledgers. It also has an aging but formidable leader, Doge Enrico Dandolo. Later accounts paint him in sharp outlines, old, ambitious, relentless, sometimes described as blind, always described as determined. Whether every detail is exact matters less than the effect he represents. Dandolo embodies the mature Venetian state patient, calculating and alert to opportunity. When the leaders of the Fourth Crusade approach Venice, they need transport on a scale few cities can provide. Venice agrees to build and supply a vast fleet ships to carry crusaders' horses and provisions across the sea. It is an extraordinary undertaking, one that requires enormous labor. The arsenal's work intensifies. Timber is gathered, rope is twisted, sails are stitched, hulls are fitted. For Venice, this contract is not simply an act of faith. It is a business arrangement, and the Republic expects payment. But when the Crusaders arrive, the money is not there in full. Here the story turns. A crusade is a grand movement, but it is also a collection of individuals with limited funds, competing interests, and imperfect coordination. The Crusader leaders cannot pay what they owe. Venice has already built the fleet. The city has already invested resources. The Republic is not inclined to absorb the loss. So a bargain is proposed, one that shifts the Crusade's course away from its declared purpose. Venice suggests that the Crusaders help it deal with a problem closer to home, a rebellious Christian city on the Adriatic Zara, modern Zadar, which had resisted Venetian authority. If the Crusaders assist in bringing Zara back under Venetian control, Venice will defer or restructure the debt and allow the expedition to proceed. This moment is morally tangled, even by the standards of its age. The Crusade's stated mission is to fight non-Christian powers, yet here it is being redirected against a Christian city. Some participants object, some hesitate, but the machinery of obligation is heavy. The Crusaders need ships. Venice holds the ships. And so the crusade moves against Zara. The capture of Zara becomes a kind of first fracture in the crusade story, a sign that the expedition is already being pulled by forces that are not purely spiritual. For Venice, it is also a sign that its Adriatic ambitions remain central. The Republic is not abandoning its local sphere. It is using a global movement to reinforce it. Yet the largest diversion is still ahead. In the complex politics of Byzantium, an opportunity appears, an imperial quarrel that invites Western intervention. A claimant to the Byzantine throne seeks help in regaining power, offering promises in return money to pay the Crusaders' debts, military support for the Crusade's ultimate aims, and most alluring for Venice concessions that could expand Venetian privileges within the empire. For a Venetian state accustomed to negotiating with Constantinople, this is a moment of profound temptation. Venice has long benefited from Byzantine trade access. It has also experienced the instability of that relationship, privileges granted resentments, stirred policies changing with emperors and factions. The chance to reshape the relationship more decisively under terms favorable to Venice is difficult to ignore, and so the crusade, already off course, is pulled toward the greatest city in the eastern Mediterranean Constantinople. It is hard to overstate the weight of Constantinople in the medieval imagination. Even if a Western traveler had never seen it, he had heard of it. Its walls were legendary, its churches were said to gleam with gold, its markets were thick with goods. It was the heart of an empire that still carried the ancient Roman claim. For Venice it was also a familiar partner, an imperial capital where Venetian merchants had long sought advantage, where privileges could mean fortunes. When the Crusader fleet arrives near Constantinople, the scene is one of immense tension. The sea fills with sails. The city's defenses rise above the water, vast and deliberate. The Crusaders and Venetians face not an anonymous enemy, but an entire civilization's center of gravity. Negotiations, threats, and uncertainties unfold in an atmosphere that feels almost unreal, like standing at the edge of a stone world older and grander than anything in the West. Events move quickly, and then, in 1204, the unthinkable happens. Constantinople is taken. The aftermath is one of rupture. The city is damaged, its order shattered. The sources describing these events can be vivid and sometimes brutal. But for our calm telling, it is enough to say that the conquest is catastrophic for the Byzantine world. The greatest Christian city of the East falls not to an external religious rival, but to fellow Christians from the West, driven by a mix of debt, ambition, opportunity, and the unpredictable momentum of crusading politics. For Venice, this is the moment when a maritime republic becomes an imperial power in a new sense. In the division of spoils and territories that follows, Venice gains an extraordinary share. It secures valuable claims and footholds across the eastern Mediterranean islands, ports, trading posts, strategic points along the routes that connect Constantinople to the Aegean and beyond. Venice's merchants gain access to assets that can be turned into long-term commercial dominance. The Republic's influence in the former Byzantine sphere expands dramatically, and Venetian ships become even more present across waters that had once been primarily Byzantine. This does not mean Venice owns an empire like a land monarch might. Venice's empire is a lattice of maritime holdings. What matters most are harbors' routes and the ability to keep commerce flowing. The Republic's new possessions are less about farmland and more about control of movement of goods, of ships, of information. In the years that follow, the political landscape of the East is transformed. A Latin empire is established in Constantinople, while Byzantine successor states persist elsewhere, continuing the struggle for legitimacy and survival. The region becomes fractured, contested, and unstable in new ways. For Venice, the chaos is both opportunity and danger. Fragmentation can open doors for a skilled trader and diplomat, but it also creates insecurity on the very routes Venice depends upon. There is also a shadow that follows Venice's triumph, the moral and cultural cost. Venetians themselves in later centuries will craft narratives that justify their actions, portraying the events as inevitable or necessary, or emphasizing the city's role as an organizer rather than a destroyer. But the deeper truth remains: Venice's rise here is tied to the weakening of Byzantium. The Republic gains wealth and power in part because the great Eastern partner it once negotiated with is wounded. This is a pattern that echoes through history. Empires rise not only through their own strength, but through the misfortunes of others. Venice's empire is built partly from the gaps that appear when older orders collapse. And yet in the Venetian mind there is also a sense of destiny. The winged lion of St. Mark, the polished rituals of the Republic, the growing pride of its merchants and councils, These elements now have a vast stage. Venice can claim not merely that it is protected and prosperous, but that it is a power with reach into the heart of the Mediterranean world. From this point on, the Serenissima enters its high tide. Venice will refine its convoy systems, expand its colonial administration, and turn its eastern footholds into an engine of wealth. The city's art and architecture will reflect this confidence. Its markets will swell with spices and silks. Its government will grow even more intricate, managing a far-flung maritime network with a careful hand. But even as Venice stands taller, the sea remains restless. Rival powers will react. Old resentments will deepen. New enemies will emerge. The conquest of Constantinople has opened a door, but it has also unsettled the entire house of Mediterranean politics. And as Venetian ships glide back toward the lagoon, heavy with new advantages and new responsibilities, the city begins to look like something it has never been before. Not merely a clever republic, but a true maritime empire, brilliant, disciplined, and shadowed by the knowledge that all victories carry their own quiet cost. The next chapter is the age when Venice lives at full height, when the Republic becomes, in the eyes of Europe, the queen of sea trade crowned not with gold, but with the steady movement of its fleets. The Serenissima at full tide. There is a particular kind of wealth that does not sit still, it moves. It moves in sacks and barrels, in bolts of cloth and small sealed boxes, in bundles tied with rope, in cargo lists, written carefully by lamplight. It moves in the slow procession of ships arriving at dawn, their hulls low in the water from the weight of what they carry. It moves through the hands of dock workers, the voices of merchants, the quiet calculations of clerks. It moves into warehouses, out into markets, onward into inland routes. And in the 13th and 14th centuries, much of that moving wealth begins to flow through one place with extraordinary regularity, Venice. After the Fourth Crusade and the Great Rupture of 1204, Venice holds new footholds across the eastern Mediterranean. These possessions are not a single continuous territory. They are a chain ports, islands, and strategic points that allow Venetian ships to travel trade and resupply with greater security. The Republic's influence is now woven through the Aegean and beyond, like a net cast wide. In Venice itself, the effect is visible. The city grows denser and more confident. The civic heart around St. Mark becomes more splendid, refined by money and taste, and the desire to display permanence. The palaces along canals become larger and more ornate. Stone and brick shaped by craftsmen rise where earlier generations built more simply. The city begins to look like an announcement. But the Venetian announcement is never a shout. It is a steady, disciplined presentation, an elegance that suggests control. This is why later centuries will call Venice La Serenissima, the most serene republic. Serenity here does not mean softness. It means the appearance of calm authority in a world often troubled by sudden violence. It means the ability to keep markets open, fleets moving, and rituals intact, even when rivals threaten and crises flicker on the horizon. At the center of this serenity is organization. Venice perfects systems that allow commerce to operate on a scale larger than most medieval states can sustain. One of the most important is the convoy system, organized fleets that sail on set schedules, protected by armed escort, moving along known routes to major markets. In a world where piracy and war can disrupt any voyage, convoys reduce risk. They also allow merchants to plan, invest, and coordinate. A city that can make shipping predictable can dominate trade, and Venice, with its disciplined government and maritime expertise, becomes unusually good at predictability. The Republic also refines its overseas administration. Venetian holdings, whether in the Adriatic, the Aegean, or farther east, require governors' courts, customs systems, and garrisons. Venice tends to send officials who are tied to the state and rotated through offices, limiting the chance that a distant governor will become a petty king. The Republic is always wary of personal power that might fracture the system. Its empire must remain a network that serves Venice, not a set of private fiefdoms. This is not always neat in practice. There are corrupt officials, local resistance, conflicts between Venetian settlers and local populations. But the overall structure holds. Venice seeks to govern its maritime empire through procedure and supervision. Meanwhile, the goods that pass through Venice become both its fortune and its identity. Spices are perhaps the most famous pepper, cinnamon, clove substances that in medieval Europe are not mere flavors, but valuable commodities, almost like currency. Spices preserve food, mask spoilage, and signal status. They arrive from distant regions through complex routes that stretch across the Islamic world and beyond. Venice does not control the entire chain, but it positions itself at a crucial stage, acting as a distributor to European markets. Silks and fine textiles also play a major role, luxury goods that transform wealth into visible splendor. Dyes and pigments, precious metals, glass-carved ivory, and exotic objects fill the warehouses and shops. At the same time, Venice exports items from Europe, woolen cloth, timber, iron, and various manufactured goods. The city becomes an exchange point where different economies meet and reshape one another. Trade also includes darker currents. Like many powers of its era, Venice is involved in trafficking human beings, enslaved people moved through Mediterranean networks. The details vary by period and region, and the human stories behind such commerce are often only partially visible in surviving records. Yet the presence of slavery in Venice's trading world is part of the truth of its empire prosperity, built not only on ingenuity and organization, but also on participation in systems of exploitation common to the medieval Mediterranean. Even when the Republic presents itself as serene and lawful, its wealth is never entirely innocent. And yet Venice's economic success does not come only from goods, it comes from services. Venice becomes a carrier, an intermediary, an organizer of movement. It earns profit by transporting cargo for others, by providing credit and financial tools, by offering secure warehousing, by establishing a legal environment where contracts can be enforced. In other words, Venice grows powerful, not merely by owning resources, but by managing flow. This management requires knowledge. Venetian merchants keep careful records. They learn foreign languages. They cultivate contacts in distant ports. They develop techniques for dealing with currency exchange, credit arrangements, and long-distance partnerships. In time, Venice's mercantile culture becomes a kind of education system. Young men learn not only how to sail, but how to write, calculate, negotiate, and understand foreign customs. In the city's daily life, this creates a distinctive atmosphere. You can picture the Rialto, already the commercial heart, buzzing with activity. Merchants gather to hear news which routes are safe, which ports are under new rule, which commodities are rising in price. Couriers arrive with letters, brokers arrange deals, money changers weigh coins. In narrow alleys nearby, craftsmen shape wood, metal, and glass. In workshops, fabrics are cut and sewn, The smell of fish salt and spice mingles in the air, and above it all, the state watches. Venice's government is unusually intertwined with commerce. The Republic regulates trade in ways meant to protect its advantage. It supervises certain industries. It shapes shipping schedules. It maintains naval readiness. The boundary between public interest and private profit is thin and often deliberately so. A successful merchant strengthens the state. A strong state protects merchants. The relationship is symbiotic, almost organic. But Venice's serenity also depends on exclusion. The political system is increasingly dominated by a narrower class of leading families. Over time, Venice will formalize this elite control, creating a patrician class whose membership becomes hereditary. This is not yet fully fixed in every detail here, but the trend is clear. As wealth grows, the families who manage it seek to secure their influence. Venice's stability is partly built on oligarchy rule, by a few tempered by procedure, and the need to keep the broader population calm and employed. The ordinary people of Venice, boatmen, dock workers, artisans, benefit from the city's prosperity, but they do not control it. Their lives are bound to the rhythm of the maritime economy. When fleets return safely, work is plentiful. When routes are disrupted, anxiety spreads. The Republic's leaders therefore understand that maintaining trade is not only a matter of profit, but of social peace. Venice also invests in spectacle, not loud spectacle, but controlled magnificence. Ceremonies around St. Mark grow more elaborate. The Doge appears in ritual contexts that emphasize continuity and order. Public art and architecture declare the city's identity as a sacred republic protected by its patron and sustained by its laws. Visitors from other lands are impressed not only by wealth, but by the sense that Venice is a coherent entity, disciplined, confident, almost timeless. And yet, beneath the calm surface, challenges are gathering. Rival powers are not idle. Genoa, another great maritime republic, competes fiercely for access to Eastern markets. Other Italian cities and European kingdoms seek a share of the trade that makes Venice rich. In the Eastern Mediterranean, the political landscape remains unstable, with Byzantine successor states and other powers contesting territories. Piracy persists, and the very success of Venice's privileges and colonies creates resentment. Even within Venice, the concentration of power among elites can breed tension. A republic that prides itself on stability must constantly manage envy, ambition, and fear. It must prevent any single family from becoming too dominant. It must maintain the appearance of fairness even when the system is tilted. And above all, Venice must keep its fleets moving, because the Venetian Empire is an empire of motion. If the ships stop, the wealth stops. If the wealth stops, the city's serenity cracks. In the next chapter, that crack will widen. Venice's rivalry with Genoa will sharpen into open conflict. The sea that has carried profit will carry war. And for a moment, the Republic will stand near the edge of ruin, fighting not only for dominance, but for survival itself. The water so often calm in Venice's canals will begin to feel like a battlefield. Genoa storms and the War of Chioggia. In the middle centuries of Venice's rise, the sea is both a mirror and a wager. On calm days, it reflects the city's confidence, its orderly quays, its steady convoys, its banners lifting gently above the water. But on harsher days, when wind thickens and waves turn restless, the sea also reflects something else, the truth that no maritime empire can be serene for long without rivals. And Venice's greatest rival is another city born from salt air and ambition, Genoa. Genoa sits on the Ligurian coast, facing westward, with a different horizon. If Venice looks toward the Adriatic and the eastern Mediterranean, Genoa looks toward the western sea lanes and the broader Latin world. Both cities become powerful for the same reason they turn maritime skill into commercial dominance. Both build fleets, both cultivate merchant networks, both learn the language of treaties, privileges, and overseas footholds, and both understand perhaps too well that in a world of scarce advantages, one republic's prosperity can feel like another's suffocation. For a time, competition can exist without full collapse into war. Merchants argue over prices, envoys trade complaints in polite phrases. Port officials raise or lower fees, rumors travel across quays, whose convoy was delayed, whose cargo was seized, whose alliance has shifted. Yet beneath these daily frictions is a deeper tension that cannot be negotiated away easily, because Venice and Genoa are not only competing for profit, they are competing for the structure of Mediterranean trade itself, who carries what, who sets terms, who becomes the indispensable middleman between East and West. The eastern Mediterranean, rich with spices, silks, and luxury goods, remains the great prize. Venice has a strong position there, strengthened by its privileges and its far-flung holdings. Genoa, too, pushes hard into this world, building its own network and securing its own bases and agreements. As both republics reach into the same markets, the sea begins to feel crowded, and every island harbor becomes suspect. A ship on the horizon could be a merchant vessel or a threat. War between them is not a single event. It is a repeated pattern flaring across decades, each conflict leaving behind new bitterness and new calculations. There are clashes and setbacks, encounters at sea where galleys ram and grapple, where sailors strain at oars, where the outcome can turn on wind timing and the discipline of a crew. When battles happen, they are often fierce but brief, decided by confusion and exhaustion as much as by strategy. Records speak of captains captured ships, lost crews scattered. The details are not always clear to us across time, but the effect is unmistakable. Trade becomes dangerous, and danger becomes expensive. One famous episode often remembered with a sense of dramatic reversal is the battle near Curzola, Cortula, in 1298, where a Venetian fleet suffers a severe defeat. The sea that had carried wealth now carries the shock of loss. Such defeats matter not only because of ships destroyed, but because of confidence shaken. A maritime empire must appear reliable. When fleets are captured, the world begins to wonder whether Venice's protection can still be trusted. And yet, Venice endures, it repairs, it reorganizes, it returns to sea. This is part of the Republic's character. It treats crisis as a problem to be managed rather than a doom to be mourned. But each war tightens the rivalry. Each clash teaches both cities new tactics and new ways to hurt one another. By the late 14th century, the rivalry reaches its most dangerous expression, the War of Chioggia. Even the name of it carries a kind of closeness that feels unsettling, because Chioggia is not a distant island in the Aegean or a far port on an exotic coast. Chioggia is near Venice, so close that the conflict is no longer about distant routes alone, but about the lagoon itself. To imagine the war picture, the geography. Venice sits inside a sheltered lagoon protected by barrier islands and narrow inlets. The lagoon is like a moat, but it is also a lifeline. It is the city's road system, its harbor, its shield. If an enemy can breach the lagoon and hold positions within it, Venice is exposed in a way that few cities ever are. The Republic's heart becomes reachable by hostile oars. In 1378, the war begins in a context of shifting alliances and grievances that have accumulated for years. Genoa gathers strength and finds partners who share an interest in cutting Venice down. Venice, too, faces the exhaustion of repeated conflict. Both republics understand that this is not a minor skirmish. It is a struggle for supremacy and perhaps for survival. As the war unfolds, the unimaginable happens. Genoese forces push into the lagoon and seize Chioggia. Suddenly, Venice's serene image is pierced by panic. Chioggia is a town at the southern end of the lagoon, controlling routes and access points. For an enemy to hold it is like a hand gripping the city's throat. It means Venetian ships have trouble moving freely. It means supplies are threatened. It means the Republic's defenses are not merely challenged at sea, but compromised at home. In the city, the psychological shock is profound. Venetians are accustomed to thinking of the lagoon as their natural fortress. They have lived for centuries with the belief that water protects them, that armies cannot easily march into their world of channels and islands. Now, a rival maritime republic has proven that ships can enter, that the lagoon can be contested, that the boundary between safety and danger is thinner than anyone wants to admit. And yet Venice does not collapse into despair, it tightens. The Republic's response is a mixture of urgency and procedure, an almost paradoxical blend that has always been its strength. Decisions are made quickly, but through the state's machinery. Resources are mobilized, crews are gathered. The arsenal works like a living engine, pushing out ships as fast as labor can shape them. The city's leaders understand that if Chioggia remains in Genoese hands, Venice's position in the world may unravel. The defense becomes personal in a way Venetian politics rarely allows. The Doge at the time, Andrea Contarini, is remembered as a figure who embodies civic determination. In stories told later, he is not a distant ruler behind palace walls, but a leader who shares the city's peril, whose presence offers reassurance. Whether every detail of that image is polished by later memory, the sense remains Venice's government presents itself as united with its people in crisis because unity is necessary to survive. On the water, Venetian commanders become symbols as well. Vetter Pisani, a naval leader whose career includes both disgrace and restoration, emerges in the popular imagination as a figure of stubborn resilience. There is something deeply Venetian in this. A man can fall out of favor, be punished, and still be called back in the moment of greatest need, because the state values competence above pride when survival is at stake. And survival is at stake. Venice's strategy turns toward a harsh but effective idea to trap the Genoese within Chioggia rather than merely assault them head-on. The lagoon, which can be a pathway for ships, can also be a cage. Channels can be blocked. Inlets can be controlled. Ships can be sunk deliberately to obstruct movement. It is an ugly kind of ingenuity, but it fits the environment. Venice knows the lagoon like a body knows its own breath. If it can close the right passages, it can starve the enemy of maneuver. So the war becomes, in part, a struggle of barriers and timing. Genoa holds Chioggia, but Venice tries to seal it off. The siege is maritime and intimate, fought not across distant seas, but in the very waters that Venetians cross in daily life. The sound of oars and commands carries across channels. The winter air can be sharp. Supplies become precious. Morale becomes as important as ships. Then comes one of those moments that changes the feel of a war, the return of help, when hope is thinning. Carlo Zeno, another Venetian commander, arrives with ships after operating elsewhere, bringing reinforcement at a crucial time. The details of his movements are part of the war's tactical complexity, but the emotional meaning is simple. Venice is not alone in its struggle, and the sea, so often the source of danger, can still deliver rescue. Gradually, through blockade pressure and the slow grind of deprivation, the balance shifts. The Genoese position becomes harder to maintain. The lagoon, which they entered as a weapon, becomes a trap. Venice's persistence, its ability to keep building, keep rowing, keep coordinating, begins to wear down the enemy. In 1380, Chioggia is recovered. The relief in Venice is immense, not only because a strategic threat is removed, but because the city's deepest belief in itself is restored. The lagoon can still protect if Venice is vigilant. The Republic can still recover from near disaster if it remains disciplined. The war ends formally with peace in 1381, and while Venice's supremacy is not absolute and its rivals are not erased, the Republic has survived the closest brush with ruin it has yet faced. The War of Chioggia becomes a lesson carved into Venetian memory. Serenity must be defended, and the sea must never be taken for granted. After the war, Venice's statecraft grows even more cautious, even more procedural. The Republic understands that its greatest enemy is not only Genoa, but fragility, economic and political fragility that can be exposed by blockade plague or shifting routes. It invests in resilience. It polishes the image of calm, because calm reassures merchants and allies. It strengthens its institutions because institutions are what remain when fear rises. And yet no victory can keep the world from changing. Even as Venice recovers a different kind of threat, moves quietly through ports and ships, one that no fleet can easily repel. Disease travels with commerce. In the coming chapters, plague will leave its mark on the city, testing Venetian endurance in a slower, more intimate way than war ever could. And in response, Venice will build not only ships and laws, but rituals of memory, art, and architecture that hold grief and beauty together like light held in glass. For now the lagoon grows quieter again. The oars slow. The market resumes its murmur. Venice breathes, tired, chastened, and still standing, ready to face the next shadowed tide. Plague glass and the work of memory. In a port city, the sea brings everything. It brings wealth and strangers and letters sealed with wax. It brings new fabrics and new flavors. It brings sailors with sunburned faces and tired eyes. It brings ideas from distant shores carried not only in books, but in habits, how to bargain, how to pray, how to build. And sometimes quietly, it brings death. Venice has always lived with a sense of fragility. The lagoon can flood, storms can wreck ships, rival fleets can breach the inlets. Yet there is a different kind of vulnerability that comes with being a crossroads, the vulnerability of closeness. In the narrow streets and crowded quays of a maritime city, whatever arrives can spread quickly, not only news and goods, but illness. In the mid-14th century, the Mediterranean world is struck by one of the great catastrophes of human history, the Black Death. The plague arrives in Europe through the routes of commerce and war, moving from port to port with a terrible efficiency. Venice, tied into the busiest networks of the Mediterranean, cannot remain untouched. Ships that bring grain and spices can also bring infected rats, fleas, and the unseen chain of transmission that turns a city's density into a weapon against itself. The precise first moments of arrival are difficult to capture in full detail. Chroniclers speak of fear and confusion, of sudden sickness of bodies appearing faster than rituals can keep pace. What matters most is the effect Venice, so proud of its stability, confronts a force that ignores law, wealth, and rank. Imagine the city at this time. A canal that yesterday carried laughter and bargaining now carries the hush of unease. A market stall is left unattended. A church bell rings more often. Houses close their shutters. People begin to watch one another with a mixture of sympathy and dread. A cough becomes a warning. A fever becomes a sentence. In a city built on proximity, on men and women passing each other on narrow bridges, on boats crowding the same channels, the plague spreads with frightening speed. Families lose members. Workshops fall silent. Crews vanish. The rhythm of trade breaks not because the sea is blocked, but because the hands that move goods are gone. For a merchant republic, this is not only a human tragedy, it is an existential crisis. If trade stops, Venice risks hunger. If workers die, shipbuilding slows. If officials fall ill, governance falters. If fear overwhelms discipline, riots and breakdown could follow. The plague, therefore, becomes a test not only of endurance, but of the Republic's capacity for organized response. And Venice responds in a way that reflects its political character with institutions. One of Venice's most significant contributions to public health history emerges from its experience with repeated plagues, the development of quarantine practices. The idea that ships and travelers might be isolated before entering the city, held apart long enough to see whether sickness appears, becomes a rational response to an invisible threat. This is not modern medicine, and Venetians do not understand germs as we do today. But they understand patterns. They notice that disease follows routes. They notice that time can separate the newly arrived from the healthy. They notice that isolating arrivals can reduce risk. The very word quarantine is connected to the practice of holding people or ships for a period often 40 days, 40 giorni, in Italian tradition. Venice will later establish dedicated quarantine islands and facilities, places where suspected cases can be held away from the dense heart of the city. It is a harsh measure, and it can be lonely, frightening, and sometimes unjust. Yet it is also an early example of a state attempting to manage epidemic risk through systematic policy. This is deeply Venetian, to take a terrifying uncertainty and respond with procedure. But procedure does not erase grief. The plague leaves scars that do not show only in population numbers. It reshapes how people think about lifetime and memory. A city that loses so many must find ways to mourn and to continue. In Venice, this mourning becomes entwined with beauty. After the worst waves of the Black Death, the city rebuilds not only with timber and stone, but with art, paintings, mosaics, and architecture that speak of both fragility and endurance. Venice's religious life, already civic and ceremonial, becomes even more charged with the desire to make meaning out of suffering. Processions, votive offerings, and the commissioning of sacred images become ways of asking for protection and expressing gratitude when the worst passes. This is one reason why Venice's later visual culture can feel so full of shimmering richness and soft melancholy at once. The city learns again and again that splendor is not the opposite of mortality. It is sometimes a response to it. Meanwhile, Venice's economy, though shaken, adapts. Trade networks shift as populations change and as new opportunities appear. Labor shortages can raise wages and alter social relations. Some families rise in wealth as others disappear. The Republic's governing elite, already strong, becomes even more committed to maintaining order and continuity because they know how quickly chaos can spread when a city is frightened. And in this era, another Venetian craft grows into a symbol of the city itself, glass. Venice has long been involved in crafts and manufacture, but glass-making becomes something especially associated with the Republic. The island of Murano near Venice becomes a center for this industry. There are practical reasons for concentrating glassmaking on an island. Furnaces are dangerous in a city that fears fire. By placing the industry apart, Venice reduces the risk of catastrophic blaze. Yet Murano also becomes a place of specialization, where skills and secrets are guarded carefully, where craftsmen refine techniques over generations. Glass is a fitting emblem for Venice. It is beautiful, luminous, and fragile. It catches light and holds it. It can be shaped into delicate forms or sturdy vessels. It is born of fire and sand transformed through skill and patience. In a city that has seen fire destroy its heart and plague empty its streets, glass becomes a kind of quiet triumph, proof that humans can take vulnerable materials and make them radiant. Venice's leaders also understand glass as an economic asset. A craft that produces high-value goods strengthens the city's finances and reputation. Venetian glass becomes sought after across Europe, traded as luxury, admired for clarity and color. The Republic protects its industry by regulating it, limiting the movement of skilled craftsmen, and guarding techniques as state secrets. This, too, is Venetian, the blending of art, commerce, and policy. And so, as the 14th century turns toward the 15th, Venice finds itself in a complex position. It has survived a near-fatal war with Genoa. It has endured plague. It has continued to trade, to build, to govern. Its institutions have proven resilient. Its cultural identity has deepened saint and lion ceremony and law beauty and melancholy. Yet a new power is rising in the eastern Mediterranean, one that will reshape the balance of the sea. The Ottoman Turks, expanding steadily, begin to press into territories that Venice has long considered part of its commercial sphere. Fortresses and islands that once felt secure begin to look exposed. Trade routes that once seemed stable begin to feel contested. Venice's empire has always depended on a particular Mediterranean order, a world where Byzantium once anchored the East, where Latin crusader states and Italian colonies could flourish, where sea lanes could be negotiated through treaties and naval strength. That order is changing. The coming centuries will bring long conflict, sometimes open war, sometimes tense diplomacy with the Ottoman Empire. Venice will fight to hold its eastern possessions, to protect its trade, to maintain its position as the mediator between East and West. And it will learn slowly and painfully that even the most disciplined republic cannot stop the tide of geopolitical transformation forever. For now, though, the city's lamps still glow on the water at night. The arsenal continues its work. Murano's furnaces burn with controlled fire, shaping fragile beauty. And Venice, carrying both grief and confidence, prepares to face an era when the greatest threat will not be a rival Italian republic, but a vast empire rising from the east. The lagoon lies calm, but beyond it the horizon grows darker with change. The Ottoman shadow. In Venice, the sea is often described with gentle language: lagoon water, turning to silver at dawn, canals reflecting lamplight, distant sails moving like quiet thoughts along the horizon. But the sea can also cast a shadow, not a shadow that arrives all at once like a storm, but a shadow that lengthens slowly over years and decades until a city realizes that the light it relied upon has changed. For Venice, that long shadow in the 15th and 16th centuries comes from the rising power of the Ottoman Empire. To understand why this is such a turning point, it helps to remember what Venice's empire has been built upon. Venice's strength is maritime. It depends on networks, islands, and ports, fortresses, and warehouses, privileges, and treaties. It depends on access to the eastern Mediterranean, those sea lanes that carry spices and silks, grain and timber, and the countless smaller goods that keep markets alive. It depends on a certain balance of power in the East, a world that once included Byzantium as a steady, if sometimes strained partner, and a patchwork of states and ports where Venetian merchants could operate. But that balance of power begins to change decisively. The Ottomans, emerging from Anatolia and expanding steadily, become one of the most formidable imperial forces of the age. They are not merely raiders or a short-lived dynasty. They are builders of a state with deep military organization, administrative capacity, and strategic ambition. Their expansion brings them into direct contact with the same coastal worlds Venice has long relied upon: the Balkans, the Aegean, the eastern Mediterranean islands, and the trade corridors leading toward the Levant. At first, this might seem like just another shift among many in a restless region. Venice has lived through changes before. It has negotiated with Byzantine's crusader states and rival Italian republics. It has adapted to new rulers in ports and islands. It has made treaties and survived wars. But the Ottoman rise is different in scale and momentum. It threatens not only one Venetian base or one route, but the structure of Venetian advantage itself. A crucial moment in this story, heavy with symbolism and consequence, comes in 1453, the fall of Constantinople to the Ottomans. For Venice, Constantinople has long been a center of trade and privilege, a place where Venetian merchants maintained quarters and conducted business under favorable conditions, though often amid tension and resentment. The city's fall signals that a world is ending. The Byzantine Empire, already weakened long before collapses, as a political anchor in the region. In its place stands a new imperial power with its own priorities, its own strategic logic, and its own ability to control choke points and ports. Venice responds, as it often does, with pragmatism. The Republic understands that it cannot simply refuse to deal with a rising empire. Trade is too important, and survival depends on maintaining access. So Venice negotiates. It seeks treaties that protect its merchants, preserve certain privileges, and allow commerce to continue. Venetian diplomats become familiar faces in Ottoman contexts, careful with language alert to ceremony ready to bargain. This diplomacy is not a sign of weakness in Venetian terms. It is a sign of realism. Yet diplomacy alone cannot erase conflict, because the interests of Venice and the Ottoman Empire overlap too intensely. Venice's empire includes islands and coastal fortresses that the Ottomans see as obstacles, foreign outposts in what they increasingly consider their sphere. Venice wants free sea lanes. The Ottomans want controlled taxation and strategic dominance. Venice thrives on being a mediator between East and West. The Ottomans can in time deal more directly with European powers, reducing Venice's role. And so the relationship becomes a long oscillation between treaty and war. Venice fights several Ottoman-Venetian wars over the centuries, each one costing money ships and often territory. The battles are not always decided in a single dramatic moment. Many are sieges, fortresses on islands, coastal cities under pressure, long campaigns where logistics matter as much as courage. For Venice, these wars are especially painful because they strike the very kind of empire it has, an empire of ports and islands. A land empire can lose a border province and still remain coherent. A maritime empire loses a key island and finds an entire route compromised. In these conflicts, Cyprus and Crete loom large in the long Venetian imagination. Crete, known to Venetians as Candia, becomes one of Venice's greatest and most enduring overseas possessions, a vital base for Eastern Mediterranean trade. It is also a place of cultural mixing and tension where Venetian rule overlays local Greek populations and traditions. Cyprus, too, becomes significant as a strategic and commercial node. These islands are not merely distant holdings. They are pillars of Venetian sea power. As Ottoman pressure grows, these pillars tremble. Venice's navy remains formidable, but maintaining maritime dominance becomes harder as the Ottoman state expands its own naval capacity and secures more coastline. The Ottoman Empire's control of key areas can tighten access to markets and routes. Even when trade continues, it does so under new conditions: more tolls, more risk, more political dependence. For Venetian merchants, the shifting conditions are felt in prices and delays. For Venetian officials, they are felt in anxious reports from governors overseas, requests for reinforcements, warnings about raids, fears of local unrest. For the leaders in Venice, every war means extraordinary expense. Warships must be built, crews paid, supplies gathered, taxes rise, debts accumulate. The Republic's disciplined financial machinery is tested again and again, and yet Venice does not give up easily. The city's political culture is built around endurance. Councils debate, but they also act. The arsenal can produce ships with remarkable speed. Venetian commanders develop strategies suited to island warfare and coastal defense. Venice forms alliances when possible, seeking partners among European powers who also fear Ottoman expansion. Sometimes these alliances are effective. Sometimes they are fragile, shaped by competing interests among Christian states. The Mediterranean is not a unified political world. Venice's rivals can also be its allies depending on the decade. And Venice must always watch the possibility that in seeking help, it might surrender autonomy. The famous naval battle of Lepanto in 1571, where a Holy League fleet defeats an Ottoman fleet, belongs to this wider Ottoman-European struggle. Venice is part of the League, and the battle becomes a moment of symbolic triumph for Christian naval power. Yet even such victories do not undo the long trend. Control of sea lanes and territories is decided over decades, not only in a single battle. Venice's larger problem is structural. The Ottoman Empire's rise coincides with other shifts that weaken Venice's old advantages. Europe's economy is changing. Oceanic routes, Portuguese voyages around Africa, and Spanish expansion into the Atlantic world begin to divert some of the most lucrative trade away from the Mediterranean. The world's commercial center of gravity starts to drift westward. Venice can still be wealthy, still be influential, but it is no longer the obvious gatekeeper of global luxury trade. So Venice faces a double pressure. From the east, the Ottoman shadow tightens around its maritime holdings. From the west, new routes and new empires begin to draw wealth away from the Mediterranean corridor that once fed Venetian greatness. In response, Venice becomes more cautious, more defensive, and in some ways more inward. It invests heavily in fortifications, turning island cities into stone shields. It develops complex diplomatic routines with Ottoman rulers, balancing tribute-like payments, trade concessions, and occasional war. It tries to maintain its convoy systems and protect commerce with armed escorts. It also leans more heavily on its mainland holdings in northern Italy, the terra firma, which provide resources and a different kind of security, though they also draw Venice into Italian land politics. This is an important transformation. Venice is becoming less purely a sea empire and more a mixed state with substantial land territories. The lagoon city that once defined itself by water now must think like a land power as well, managing farms, towns, and armies on the mainland. This helps cushion losses overseas, but it also changes Venice's identity. The Republic's gaze is no longer solely fixed on the horizon. It must also watch the plains and rivers of northern Italy. Yet even as Venice adapts, there is a quiet sorrow in the story. Venice's empire was once a confident lattice across the eastern Mediterranean, built on privileges and maritime skill. Now, piece by piece, that lattice is strained. Wars erode holdings, treaties come with compromises, routes become less profitable. The Republic survives, but survival begins to feel like holding ground rather than gaining it. Still, Venice remains Venice. Its culture continues to flourish. Its art glows with color and light. Its institutions maintain an appearance of serenity. The city continues to welcome merchants and travelers, even as the larger world shifts around it. It continues to build and repair, to regulate and record, to stage rituals that reassure citizens that the Republic endures. But the Venetian leaders, those men in quiet council chambers, can sense what is happening. They can sense that their empire's age of unquestioned maritime dominance is fading, not because Venice has suddenly become weak, but because the world has become larger and more competitive. And in that widening world, even the most disciplined republic must face limits. In the next chapter, we will move more fully into that changing global landscape, the Atlantic world, rising the Mediterranean's relative decline, and Venice's attempt to remain relevant as its old sea roads lose their centrality. The lagoon will still shimmer at sunset, and St. Mark's Lion will still watch from stone columns. But beyond the horizon, the routes of wealth will begin to bypass the Adriatic like currents that no longer turn toward Venice. The Atlantic world and the fading of the sea roads. There is a moment sometimes when a city realizes that the world is still moving, even if its own waters look calm. Venice has spent centuries mastering the Mediterranean. It has learned the moods of the Adriatic winds, the habits of distant ports, the slow logic of treaties and convoys. It has built an empire not from broad inland plains, but from sea lanes and harbors, an empire of movement and exchange. For a long time this has made Venice feel almost inevitable, as if the world's wealth must pass through its canals the way the tide passes through the lagoon's inlets. But the 15th and 16th centuries introduce a change that is not merely another rival, not merely another war, but a shift in the world's geometry. The great routes of commerce begin to bend away from the Mediterranean. From the western edge of Europe, new voyages push outward. Portuguese ships explore down the coast of Africa and eventually find routes to the Indian Ocean. Spanish expansion reaches across the Atlantic, drawing unimaginable new resources and possibilities into European imagination. The details of these oceanic transformations are vast, involving conquest, colonization, and new systems of extraction that reshape global history. For Venice, what matters most is the consequence. Some of the most profitable streams of luxury trade, especially spices, can increasingly be accessed without passing through the traditional Mediterranean corridors. This does not mean the Mediterranean becomes irrelevant overnight. It remains a busy sea. Venice remains wealthy, cultured, and active. But the sense of centrality begins to weaken. The old claim that the richest goods must flow through Venetian networks becomes less certain. And Venice, always attentive to practical realities, begins to feel the change in numbers before it feels it in pride. A merchant who once made a fortune from a certain cargo finds margins narrowing. A ship owner who once relied on predictable demand hears rumors of alternative sources. The prices of spices fluctuate as supply chains shift. Competitors gain leverage. The Republic's treasury, which has long depended on customs and commercial taxes, must adjust to new conditions. At the same time, the Ottoman pressure described in the previous chapter continues tightening the political complexity of Mediterranean trade. Even when Venice trades successfully with the East, it does so in a world where access can be interrupted by war, where tolls and diplomatic concessions eat into profit, where the Republic must accept that another imperial power controls many of the gateways it once navigated more freely. So Venice faces a double recalibration, shifting global routes to the west and growing imperial strength to the east. In response, the Republic does what it has always done. It adapts slowly and carefully. One path of adaptation is diversification. Venice leans more heavily on its mainland territories, the terra firma, which it has expanded over previous centuries. The mainland provides agricultural resources, timber, and strategic depth. It also ties Venice more deeply into the politics of northern Italy, the rivalries of duchies and kingdoms, the shifting alliances that can pull Venice into wars not of the sea but of the land. In this sense, Venice's identity as a purely maritime empire becomes more complicated. The lagoon city must become a balancing state, part naval power, part land power, part cultural beacon. Another path of adaptation is financial sophistication. Venice has long used credit and partnership finance, but in these centuries, its financial life becomes even more important. Wealth is invested not only in ships and cargo, but in government bonds and public debt systems that allow the state to raise funds for war and infrastructure. The Republic's ability to manage public finances becomes a kind of strength in itself. Venice can endure long conflicts and economic shifts, partly because it has developed ways to mobilize wealth through institutions rather than relying solely on sudden conquest or royal taxation. Yet public debt is also a sign of strain. Wars against the Ottomans and other rivals are expensive. Maintaining fleets and fortresses costs money year after year. As trade profits change the burden of funding, the state can feel heavier. Venetian leaders must manage not only external threats but internal confidence, ensuring that citizens and investors still believe the Republic is stable enough to repay its obligations. Venice's cultural life continues to glow in this period, perhaps even brighter, because the city senses change and responds by emphasizing what it can still control: beauty, ceremony, identity. This is the age of some of Venice's most celebrated artistic achievements, painting that captures light as if it were liquid architecture that makes stone feel airy music that fills churches with layered sound. Venice becomes, in European imagination, a city of spectacle and refinement, a place where art and public ritual are woven tightly together. But beneath the cultural brilliance, the empire's overseas dominance is fading. Venice still holds important possessions for a time, and it continues to trade across the Mediterranean. Yet it increasingly finds itself reacting rather than steering. In many regions, it must negotiate from a position of reduced leverage. Rivals and new powers shape conditions. Routes shift. Some colonies become less profitable, more costly to defend. The old Venetian model control key ports, dominate convoys, mediate east-west trade becomes harder to sustain as the world's center of gravity expands outward into oceans Venice does not control. Venice does attempt to participate in wider European commerce. It trades with Atlantic ports such as Southampton, Bruges, and London, linking itself into broader networks. Venetian merchants and diplomats remain active. The Republic is not suddenly isolated. But it is no longer the singular gate through which the richest goods must pass. It becomes one important node among others. And this is perhaps the most profound change of all the loss of inevitability. A power that once felt like the natural queen of Mediterranean commerce now must accept that the world's wealth can move by other routes. The sea lanes Venice has mastered remain significant, but they are no longer the only highways of global trade. Venice's political culture responds by becoming even more conservative, more committed to preserving what exists, rather than expanding into uncertain new ventures. The governing elite already entrenched tends to prioritize stability. Innovation continues in art and craftsmanship, but in geopolitics and Empire Venice becomes a state focused on maintaining dignity and survival, rather than chasing new oceans. The 17th and 18th centuries deepen this sense of slow transformation. Venice remains a republic with ceremonial grandeur. The Doge still presides, the councils still meet the city, still stages rituals that feel timeless. Travelers arrive and are enchanted by the city's atmosphere, its reflections, its music, its masks, and festivals. Venice becomes increasingly a symbol as well as a power, a place where the past feels alive on the water. But symbol is not the same as dominance. The Republic's military relevance declines, its overseas holdings shrink. Its trade, while still present, is less commanding. Other European states' monarchies with larger populations and expanding colonial empires begin to wield power on scales Venice cannot match. The old maritime empire built on a lattice of ports cannot compete with the new oceanic empires built on continents and global extraction. And yet Venice persists, in part, because it has always understood endurance. The city knows how to keep institutions functioning, how to keep public order, how to keep an image of serenity, even when the underlying world changes. Its leaders become caretakers of a legacy as much as governors of an expanding empire. This is where the story begins to carry a particular softness, a melancholy that fits Venice's watery light. Because Venice is not falling in flames like a conquered fortress, it is fading like evening. The decline is slow enough that people can grow used to it, even as it reshapes everything. The Republic becomes less feared, less decisive, more admired than obeyed. Its power becomes cultural, its art, its architecture, its myth of serene continuity, while its geopolitical weight slips away. And then, in the late 18th century, the world convulses again with new kinds of armies and ideologies. The French Revolution changes the language of politics. Napoleon Bonaparte rises with a kind of speed and force that old republics cannot easily accommodate. Italy becomes a theater for modern war. Venice, which has long survived by careful neutrality and negotiation, finds itself facing a power that does not fit its old methods. The next chapter is the final one, the end of the Republic in 1797, the passing of Venice through foreign hands, and the strange afterlife of an empire that becomes in time a memory preserved in stone and water. The canals will still reflect the moon. The Lion of St. Mark will still look outward. But the world that once moved through Venice like a tide will now move past it, leaving the city with its beauty, its institutions, and the quiet question of what remains when an empire becomes a legend. 1797 and the afterlife of an empire. In the late 18th century, Venice still looks from a distance like itself. The lagoon still opens like a pale mirror beneath the morning sky. The domes and towers still rise with that familiar, gentle confidence. The facades along the Grand Canal still catch the light, as if the city were made for reflection. Gondolas still slide through narrow passages where voices soften and footsteps become rare. In the Piazza San Marco, pigeons gather in slow circles, and the stones hold centuries of processions, proclamations, and patient waiting. And yet, under this familiar surface, something has changed. For a long time, Venice's power depended on the art of balance between East and West, between rival empires, between the interests of its own leading families. The Republic survived by being careful, by choosing neutrality when others exhausted themselves in war, by maintaining stable institutions when surrounding states shifted and fractured. It became the most serene, not because it was always strong in arms, but because it learned how to outlast storms. But the end of the 18th century brings a new kind of storm. The French Revolution breaks open older political languages. It sends new ideas across Europe, but also new armies shaped by mass mobilization, by a different relationship between state and citizen, by a sense of momentum that feels unlike the old dynastic wars. And in this new Europe, Napoleon Bonaparte rises with startling speed, turning Italy into a theater of modern conquest. Venice by this time is no longer the maritime empire that once controlled sea lanes across the eastern Mediterranean. It is still wealthy in culture, still famous in image, still proud of its rituals and laws. But its military force is diminished compared with the great monarchies around it. Its overseas holdings have largely been lost or reduced. Its trade has been reshaped by global routes that bypass the old Mediterranean corridor. The Republic remains, but it remains like an old ship kept beautiful in harbor, its sails folded, its journeys fewer. Venice's leaders, watching the world shift, cling to a familiar strategy: neutrality. Neutrality has served Venice well for centuries. It is, in a way, the Republic's last great skill, the ability to avoid becoming the battlefield of others. By refusing to fully commit, Venice hopes to preserve itself, to keep its institutions intact, to remain a space where commerce and life can continue, even as Europe shakes. But neutrality is fragile when a conqueror wants not partnership, but control. Napoleon's campaigns in Italy unfold rapidly. States fall. Alliances crumble. The old map seems to melt and reform under marching boots. Venice finds itself trapped between forces it cannot easily deter: French power on one side, Austrian interests on the other, and the broader collapse of the old order all around. The Republic attempts diplomacy. It attempts caution. It attempts to remain calm in the way it always has, measured, ceremonial, procedural. Yet the new war does not respect ceremony. In 1797, Napoleon turns his attention fully toward Venice. Accusations are made about Venetian hostility, about conspiracies, about violations of neutrality. The exact political theater of these charges is complex, but the outcome is clear. The French decide that Venice will not remain independent. For the Republic, the moment is almost unimaginable. Venice has existed for over 1,000 years as a self-governing state. Its institutions have survived emperors, crusades, plagues, and Ottoman wars. Its councils have met through centuries of shifting Mediterranean power. Its doges have come and gone, each one held within a framework designed to preserve the state beyond individuals. Now that framework faces something it cannot negotiate away. In May 1797, the Venetian Republic is dissolved. The great council symbol of Venice's oligarchic but stable governance votes itself out of existence. The last Doge, Ludovico Manin, resigns. The rituals that once expressed serene continuity are interrupted, as if a song sung for centuries has suddenly been cut short. There is an emotional dimension to this that is hard to capture fully because it is not only political change, it is the collapse of a civic identity. Imagine the atmosphere in the city, quiet, heavy, uncertain. The same canals that once carried triumphant fleets now carry rumors. The same piazza that once staged pageantry now holds a kind of stunned stillness. People who have always lived under the Republic's familiar symbols, St. Mark's lion, the Doge's ceremonies, the language of Venetian sovereignty, must now confront the fact that those symbols no longer guarantee anything. When a monarchy falls, there is often a clear replacement, a new dynasty, a new king. When Venice falls, it is a different kind of loss, the end of a political tradition that prided itself on being impersonal and enduring. And then comes the humiliating clarity of treaties. Later in 1797, the Treaty of Campo Formio is signed, and Venice, its territories, and its fate is traded between larger powers. The city and its remaining holdings pass to Austria. In this act, Venice becomes not a sovereign negotiator, but an object on a diplomatic table. This is the final transformation from empire to possession. Under Austrian rule, Venice's life continues, but its autonomy is gone. The city remains beautiful, and the people continue their trades, their crafts, their quiet routines. Yet the center of decision is elsewhere now. Venice becomes part of other empires' calculations rather than the author of its own. The 19th century brings more changes. Nationalism rises. The idea of Italy as a unified nation grows stronger. Venice, with its long history, becomes a symbol of Italian cultural heritage, even as it remains under foreign control. After the upheavals of the Napoleonic era and the shifting arrangements of European powers, Venice eventually becomes part of the Kingdom of Italy in the 19th century, and its long story as an independent republic becomes part of the past. And yet, as Venice loses political sovereignty, it gains another kind of immortality, the immortality of memory. Because Venice's empire leaves marks that cannot be erased by treaty. It leaves marks in architecture, palaces built on trade wealth churches, shaped by east and west, the Basilica of St. Mark, with its shimmering mosaics that speak of Byzantium and the sea. It leaves marks in law and governance, an example of a long-lived republic with intricate checks on power, admired and studied by later thinkers. It leaves marks in commerce, the model of a maritime network that connected continents through shipping finance and administration. It leaves marks in culture, paintings, and music myths and festivals, a city that learned to turn civic identity into art. Even Venice's decline becomes part of its legacy. Because Venice teaches in a gentle and melancholy way that empires do not always fall through sudden destruction. Some fade through shifts in trade routes, through slow loss of strategic advantage, through the emergence of new kinds of power that make old skills less effective. Venice's serenity, once a form of strength, becomes, in its last centuries, a kind of beautiful stubbornness and insistence on continuity in a world that is no longer willing to grant it. Today, Venice is still a living city. It is also a symbol carried around the world, the image of domes rising from water, of boats sliding under bridges of a place where time feels layered. Millions walk its streets and cross its squares, sometimes scarcely thinking of the republic that once ruled sea lanes and held colonies, that negotiated with emperors and sultans, that built ships and treaties with equal precision. But if you slow down, if you imagine the city not as a postcard, but as a long memory, you can still feel traces of the empire in the stones. You can stand near St. Mark's and remember that the winged lion once flew on banners above distant ports. You can look at the water and remember that Venice's true roads were always liquid. You can picture convoys departing at dawn, the oars dipping in steady rhythm, carrying not only cargo but the confidence of a republic that believed it had made order out of uncertainty. And you can also feel in the soft echo of footsteps in a narrow alley the quiet truth that all power is temporary. The Venetian Empire rises from refuge and trade, grows through privileges, and discipline reaches a high tide of maritime dominance, and then slowly yields to larger transformations. The Ottoman shadow the Atlantic world, the arrival of modern conquest. Yet its legacy remains unusually vivid, perhaps because Venice always understood better than most the art of turning impermanence into beauty. In the end, Venice leaves the world not only an example of commercial ingenuity or political endurance, but a mood, a way of seeing history as something like water, always moving, always reshaping what it touches, leaving behind reflections that shimmer even after the tide has gone. And as night falls over the lagoon, the city's lights begin to tremble in the canals, as if the water itself is remembering. The wind carries a faint salt scent through the darkened streets. Somewhere a bell rings softly, and the sound travels across stone and water unhurried. The empire is gone. But the story remains, floating gently like a lantern on the tide, inviting you to drift with it, and if you wish to let your thoughts grow quiet as the centuries settle into the calm of sleep.